And here we are. So, after 2 years, young Darwin drops out of medical school. By all accounts, his father was a very kind, almost indulgent father. But even the kindest fathers have been known to lose their tempers at time. And Darwin's dad allegedly fussed at him and said, "You care for nothing but shooting, dogs, and rat catching, and you will be a disgrace to yourself and all your family." So, plan A for the offspring did not work out. Now it was time to find plan B. Well, Darwin's not going to be a doctor. He's not interested in being a lawyer. He's not interested in joining the military and becoming an officer, which was kind of the other thing for children of wealthy families to do in Britain at the time. And his dad doesn't want him to just become idle. The family had enough money that Darwin probably would never have had to have, gotten a job at all. He could have just, spent his days hunting and going to parties, but he didn't want to do that. So Darwin's dad sent him to Christ College of Cambridge University in 1828 to study for the Anglican priesthood. Britain had and still does an official national church, the Church of England. The branch of it in the United States, by the way, is the Episcopal Church. The Episcopal Church in the USA is part of the Anglican Communion. At this time, people outside of the Anglican Church were denied certain legal rights. This has changed now, but at the time you had to be Anglican or you couldn't really be a full citizen. Darwin's family had actually been, they called them dissenters, not Anglicans, but Darwin decided he could be a perfectly good Anglican and it was all good. And so he went off to study for the Anglican priesthood. This, by the way, is his college rooms as they would have looked in 1828. So yeah, there's his dorm room. They actually found a few years ago some very old records from this time that had just been, sitting locked in a drawer or something. So we know things like, Darwin paid extra to have vegetables with dinner. There was a college dining hall, and Darwin was well off enough to pay a little bit extra to have vegetables. So there, a little different situation from what we have now. You'll notice that he has a gun in his room. Remember, Darwin was a keen amateur hunter and was always out on the first day of the season, blasting away. The classes weren't that great. Darwin's curriculum was mostly math, Latin and Greek, and theology. He had to do things like compose original poetry in Latin, um, study Euclidean geometry and things like that. None of this was particularly interesting, and Darwin later felt that most of his organized studies were a waste of time. As he put it, my time was wasted as far as the academical studies were concerned. I attempted mathematics, but I got on very slowly. The work was repugnant to me. He later regretted not learning more math because, as he put it in his autobiography, people with a mathematical talent almost seem to have an extra sense. But he learned enough to pass, and he would end up graduating not with honors, but still ranked in, I think, the top 10. But the way the university was set up at the time basically meant that nobody had to work really hard if they didn't want to. And Darwin didn't work really hard as far as his classes went. What the hell are you going to do composing original Latin poetry? But he did have plenty of time to indulge his hobbies of hunting. Oh, he and some friends actually formed a student club. And the goal of the club was basically to eat every species of bird that could be found in the British Isles. I think they called themselves the Glutton Club. And they go out and hunt for, random species of birds and then prepare them and eat them at their dinners. Apparently, the club broke up after they tried eating an owl. The European brown owl apparently tastes absolutely nasty when cooked. It's a close relative of the American barred owl, so I'm going to recommend that you don't eat those. If you see owl on the menu anywhere, just get the chicken. See, never let it be said I don't teach important life information. He was also really keen on collecting beetles, and a classmate of his drew these cartoons of Darwin with his insect collecting net riding off on a giant beetle. Down here at the bottom, it says, "Go it, Charlie," meaning go for it. Go for it. Get out there and get those beetles, riding on a beetle. He actually sent some records of his finds, and they ended up getting published in a book called Illustrations of British Entomology. So there you have his notes on the abundance of beetles near Cambridge in the genus Colymbetes. This is a Colymbetes beetle up here. So classes are boring, but he's really into beetle collecting by this time. He's big time into hunting. And he struck up an acquaintance with Professor John Stevens Henslow, who is their professor of natural science at the time. There's not much of a science department because remember, this is still the time when we don't have majors, college is entirely pre-professional. Most science at this time is done by amateurs who have enough money and spare time to indulge their tastes. And one person could basically teach all of the science classes that were required. And it was John Stevens Henslow. He took classes from Henslow, but he also became friends with him. They used to go on hikes together, they'd walk together. Henslow had Darwin over for dinner a lot, and Darwin really became a close friend of the family. Since Henslow would have other important scientists over for dinner, Darwin got to meet, some of the best scientific minds in Britain at the time. And at Henslow's recommendation, Darwin went and studied field geology with one of the top geologists at the time, a gentleman by the name of Adam Sedgwick. This isn't specifically Sedgwick, but that's a geologist doing geological things back in the day. I like the top hat. We need to bring that back. Why he was studying science in the first place was because he had to read the works of Reverend William Paley. They were required reading at Cambridge, in particular, a book by Paley called The Principles of Moral Philosophy. Paley also wrote a book called Natural Theology. And this was Darwin's favorite reading at the time. Darwin absolutely loved it. And if we look at Paley, it explains why Darwin, who was studying for the ministry, was encouraged to study science in the first place. Paley wrote this entire book as an argument for the existence of God. And it was not the first, but the clearest statement of what's still called the argument from design. Living things are complicated. They're made of lots of parts. Every part has to be in the right place and work together with the other parts, or the entire thing is not going to function. Right? Living things are complex. The way that we know that you get complex things is to design them. Living things must also be designed. And as Paley concluded his book, the marks of design are too strong to be got over. Design must have had a designer. That designer must have been a person. That person is God. And Paley used a metaphor that's still famous. He starts his book saying, let's say I'm walking through a field and I trip over a rock. And I ask, what is that rock doing there? Well, there's no really interesting deep answer to that. Rocks just sit around. They're just the kind of thing that you find on the surface of the earth, and that rock might have been sitting there for, millions of years, whatever. Rocks are just there. Suppose instead of tripping over a rock, you trip over a watch. And you should be asking, hey, what is that watch doing there? Well, Paley says you would notice that, first of all, the watch is made of lots of parts. You could open the face and look at all the little gears and cogs inside. The parts are all put together in a very precise way. The parts all have a very precise shape. If you change the way in which the parts are put together, or you change the shape of the parts, the watch is going to stop running. And the watch does something. Specifically, it tells time. It seems to have a function, it seems to have a purpose. And if you mess with the arrangement of the watch parts, you destroy the watch's function. It won't keep proper time. It may not run at all. Paley concluded the inference, we think, is inevitable that the watch must have had a maker who comprehended its construction and designed its use. The only way you're going to get watches is if you have intelligent watchmakers who design the watch first and then build it for a purpose. Watches aren't put together just because somebody likes assembling gears. They're put together to do something. The rest of the book is this long list of examples from the natural world about how living things are complex and so beautifully adapted to do various things, so beautifully shaped in order to, live and feed and reproduce in such surprising ways sometimes, that Paley concludes the only explanation for how living things got there is that they were designed by a designer who is so skilled and so intelligent that he must be equivalent to God, or at least the God of traditional Christian thought. If the existence of a watch requires you, forces you to accept the existence of a watchmaker, how much more must the existence of a living being demonstrate that there must be a divine creator? Or so said Paley. Now, to give you a full response to Paley is going to take the rest of the course. Um, will It'll take a while before I can show you what the answer to Paley is. A problem that you run into right now is that asserting that the earth and all of its life are created by a divine designer sounds really good until it runs smack dab into the problem of evil. Because the living world, as beautiful and complex as it is also a place of terrible pain and suffering. Why did, my cat, who is sitting right here looking at me and demanding head scritches, is beautifully designed as a very efficient predator. This one doesn't go out very much, but cats, of course, are, predators that catch and kill mice and birds and all kinds of little animals, and sometimes drag them into the house, or sometimes, throw them up on the doorstep. But why are cats designed to play with mice and, go whacking them over the head and clawing at them, for minutes or maybe hours before finally killing the mice? Why do they cause cruelty? Why do cats kill animals and birds that they don't even eat? Why did God create those wasps that lay their eggs inside the bodies of caterpillars, and the eggs hatch into larvae that grow by eating the insides of the caterpillar, saving the vital organs for last until the caterpillar is just this twitching, shriveled shell of itself that's been devoured from the inside out. That's a real thing, by the way. There are wasps that do that. They were the inspiration for the life cycle of the xenomorphs in the Alien franchise of movies. There are real critters that do that. Why? There's a hymn that was written at about this time. I'll give you the American tune. It's usually sung to a different tune in Britain. And it's an expression of Paley's natural theology. And it's the one that goes, all things bright and beautiful, all creatures great and small, all things wise and wonderful, the Lord God made them all. Each little flower that opens, each little bird that sings, he made their glowing colors, he made their tiny wings. It's beautiful. Monty Python got a hold of it and they wrote lyrics, and I'll sing it to the American tune. They go, all things foul and gangrenous, all creatures gross and squat, all things rude and nasty, the Lord God made the lot. Each, let's see, each beastly little hornet, each horrible little squid, who made the spiky urchins, who made the sharks, he did. So if you're going to attribute the beauty and wonder and complexity of creation to God, you also have to hold God responsible for the ugly and the painful and the suffering. You know, if God is truly a good creator of all good things, why is there a medical specialty called pediatric oncology? I'll let you work that out for yourselves. That's not my row to hoe. We've all got to grapple with these questions in our own way. And that's ultimately a reason why Darwin ended up rejecting Paley's arguments, because if you're going to attribute the beauty of creation to God, then like either there's two gods and one of them's evil, or you're going to have to attribute the gratuitous suffering to God. Not just that there's pain, but that there's so much of it. Like my man Neil Peart said, you know, such a lot of pain on this earth, it's somehow so badly arranged. And again, how you choose to feel about the matter is your road to walk, not mine. We've all got to come up with our own solutions. But that's one of the big flaws in Paley's argument, and it's not one that he successfully grappled with in his book. But whatever you think of it now, Paley and natural theology are historically important because they gave people a reason to study biology. This is why Darwin, who's studying to be a minister in the Anglican Church, is encouraged to take science classes. The idea was that you could learn as much about God by reading the Bible as you could by studying nature. As Francis Bacon had said, you had to study both the book of God's word and the book of God's works. You know, that you could learn as much about God by studying nature as you could by reading the Bible. They complemented each other. And certainly Darwin was very impressed. As he later reminisced, I could almost formally have said it by heart. He almost had it memorized. So he graduated in 1831, and what he was planning on doing was getting ordained, and then he'd be a minister, and he'd have some church somewhere, and he'd preach sermons and, you know, visit his parishioners and, you know, live the, you know, life of a country priest. And that would have been that, except enter a British Navy captain named Captain Robert Fitzroy. The bigger context. Okay, a little bit about world history and politics and all that. The United States became independent in what, 17, the Battle of Yorktown, 1781. They declared independence in 76. Then they had to fight the revolution. And the American Revolution had ended up inspiring a wave of revolutions in Spanish and Portuguese South America. This is the time of people like Simon Bolivar and Bernardo O'Higgins in Chile. And Spain's former colonies were breaking away, becoming independent nations. Kind of a long and sometimes painful history, but this is what's going on in South America. Britain has always tried not to let other European countries gain too much power. So Britain is supporting independence, doesn't want the Spanish to march in and take them back. The other thing that's going on is that Britain is really developing as a world naval power. You know, they used to say Britannia rules the waves. And if you have a big navy, what you've got to have is very accurate maps. You know, there were actually cases where, you know, very expensive ships and irreplaceable crews would sink because the ship had, you know, run into a rock that wasn't marked on any of the charts. So the British Navy was sending surveying voyages out all over the globe, mapping and charting coastlines and islands. Fitzroy was captain of a ship called Her Majesty's ship Beagle. This is the Beagle. The Beagle was not very big. The biggest sailing ships of the day could pack as many as 120 cannons. The Beagle could pack 10. You know, this is the, you know, this is like the Ford Ranger of the Navy at the time. This is not a ship, you know, that's going to be fighting in line of battle. Ships like the Beagle, the Cherokee class brig, as it was called, were used to carry messages. They were used to, you know, chase off pirates and smugglers. They were used to show the flag, meaning sailing into a foreign port and basically reminding everybody, hi, we're the British Navy. We have lots of ships with very big cannon. Everybody play nice. You know, the same kind of diplomacy that the US does now with its Navy. And ships like the Beagle were in use of doing this charting work. And the Beagle's mission was to chart the coast of South America. Because if Britain ever needs to send a fleet down to South America, they need to know, you know, what the coastline looks like so they don't run into rocks. So they're charting the coastline of South America and the island at the southernmost tip of South America, an island called Tierra del Fuego, land of fire. Now, the Beagle had actually gone out on an earlier voyage to chart South America. That ended badly because the original captain, a guy by the name of Captain Pringle Stokes, had committed suicide. He'd shot himself. Fitzroy had been put in command and he'd finished the first voyage, but he wanted to go back for a second voyage and do everything right this time. And he finally got permission from the Royal Navy to send the Beagle out again and finish the job of surveying the South American coastline. Where does Darwin come into all this? First of all, as part of the mapping, Fitzroy wanted to have somebody who was trained as a naturalist, you know, who knew plants and animals and rocks, because that's the kind of thing that could be useful for commerce or military use. You know, if you're sailing off the coast of South America and your mast falls down, where's the nearest place you can steer to get timber? You know, where can you find a tree that you can chop down and use to build a new mast? Where are the nearest sources of drinkable water? Where are there animals that you can shoot if your men need fresh meat? Or where is there fruit you can gather if they're dying of scurvy? Um, are the natives of such and such a place likely to be friendly to you, or are they going to try to eat you? All of those are things that the military needed to know. So Fitzroy wanted to have someone who was trained in biology and geology on the voyage. The other reason he wanted to bring somebody was ship's captain in those days, when the ship's at sea, the captain is God. Uh, this is a small ship. There's no place to get away. It's going to be a bunch of mostly, young testosterone laden men who are going to be smelling each other's stinky feet for years, packed together in very tight quarters, living right on top of each other, spending weeks without having, so much as a letter from home. There's no email or, anything like that. Having to work a physically demanding job, because somebody has to climb up and raise those sails and lower those sails and, repair the sails and all of that. That work has to be done quickly and efficiently as part of a team. As everybody has to pull together. There's a risk that they'll die and not come back. There are, storms they have to deal with. They might have to do hard physical labor in a storm for many, many hours. So it's demanding work. Everybody is cramped together. That is a powder keg ready to go off, right? If you get mad at people, you can't just take a walk to get away from them, because where are you going to walk? You're in the middle of the damn ocean. To maintain control, the captain has to rule with an iron fist. Anybody on the ship, the captain has the right to flog or imprison, clap him in irons, or even execute. The captain's absolutely got to maintain discipline, and the captain can't have any friends. If the captain starts playing favorites, that's a good way to get the crew to mutiny, to refuse to obey the captain and maybe shove him overboard or something. That puts terrible psychological strain on the captain. And remember, the first captain of the Beagle had committed suicide. That is understandable because of the tremendous loneliness that a ship's captain is subjected to. The captain can't be buddies with anyone. Fitzroy himself had a family history of mental illness. He knew what the pressure was like. He was afraid it was going to strain him beyond what he could endure. And he wanted to bring somebody along who he could get along with, who he could blow off steam to, and who was outside the ship's chain of command. Somebody who was not an officer, not an enlisted man, somebody that he could speak to as an equal. Somebody he could not necessarily be besties with, but somebody who could be a safety valve for the kind of emotional pressure that he would be under. Henslow at first wanted to go himself, and Henslow said, "I want to go." And Henslow's wife said, "That's great, honey, you should go." And Henslow said, "I can't go." So they asked a couple of other people, and Henslow finally said, "Hey, I know this student who would be really good. He's very smart. He knows a lot. More importantly, he gets along with everybody." Every account of Darwin's life I have ever read suggests that the man was just colossally nice. Nobody had anything bad to say about him. He kept his temper under control. He was gentle and easygoing, and just generally an incredibly nice guy. So Fitzroy contacts Darwin, who says, "Yes, thank you. I would love to sail all the way around the world." Darwin's father's a little skeptical, especially because Darwin's father would be paying the bills. But Darwin was finally allowed to go. And there's the Beagle in the Thames River just before leaving England, just after Christmas in 1831. Turns out that Darwin was frequently seasick and spent a lot of time in his hammock. Um, he was allowed a very small cabin of his own that was about 6 feet by 5 feet. And even then, they had to store the maps in Darwin's cabin, so he didn't have an actual bed. He slept every night in a hammock over the map chest. And he couldn't bring a lot of stuff with him, but he did bring a book that had just been published by a man named Charles Lyell called Principles of Geology. Lyell was a former lawyer who had turned to science, and he devised new ways of thinking about the Earth and reconstructing the Earth's history using geological evidence. And the approach that he pioneered was called uniformitarianism. What's that? The dominant theory at the time was that Earth history had been dominated by catastrophes, that everything had been pretty much the same on Earth for millions of years. Nobody really knew how much, but many millions of years. And then boom, some kind of global catastrophe had happened, some kind of planet-wide fire or massive volcanic eruption or ginormous flood or something like that, wiped out most of the life on Earth, completely reshaped the planet, and then new life forms come in from somewhere. We're not sure where yet. This still does survive. We still have pretty good evidence that there have been catastrophic events in Earth history. You might know about the asteroid hitting the Earth 65 odd million years ago, the effects of which offed the dinosaurs, except for the birds. So there have been catastrophes like that, but that's not all. Lyell begged to differ. He first proposed that if you wanted to study the past, you had to start with the foundational axiom that the laws of science have not changed over time. Gravity's always been attractive. Nothing travels faster than light in a vacuum. Carbon's always had 6 atoms in the nucleus and 6 electrons outside. The basic laws of physics and chemistry haven't changed over time. From that, you have to assume what he called uniformity of process, which is the idea that the natural processes that you can observe today have always operated. There's always been erosion. There's always been the forces that uplift mountain ranges that we can actually observe today. There's always been changes in the sea level of the kind that we can observe happening now. There's always been ocean circulation. There's always been weather patterns, storms and hurricanes and winds and things like that. All these natural processes going on Earth have always been in operation since the Earth began, however the Earth began. I should mention that Lyell argued that those processes have always operated at the same rates, and that ultimately the Earth hadn't really changed because all of those processes balanced each other out. That erosion might wear down one mountain range, but mountain building processes would build another one, and so your net amount of mountains on Earth never really altered. We don't really accept those. A lot of these processes can vary a great deal in how fast they happen, but we still generally accept uniformity of law and process. So what happens when you do that? It means you don't have to assume that the Earth has been altered by monster catastrophes. To explain the evidence that you find in the rocks, you need processes that can be observed today and lots of time. Now, in an upcoming lab, you're going to see an example of this reasoning applied to a volcano on the island of Sicily called Etna. Lyle, remember, is independently wealthy from his law practice. Lyle actually took a tour of Italy and observed a lot of things himself, and you'll learn about Etna later. For right now, I want to show you a place that he visited. This is the ruins of a Roman temple called the Temple of Serapis at a place called Pozzuoli, close to the city of Naples. Okay, what we know about the temple is this. It was built on land because who builds temples under the ocean? We know from inscriptions in the temple, mentioning Roman emperors and other people whose dates we know it was in use at least up until the year 200. We know now that it's right at the edge of the sea. You can see reflections of the columns. The old temple floor is now submerged at high tide. So what has at least happened is that the temple must have sunk in the space of 200 of about 1600 years, because it was originally built on land and now the floor gets wet every time the tides come in. There's more. The columns right in this area, right there, they're shot full of holes. They look like Swiss cheese. And what makes holes in rock is a type of marine clam. It's called the date mussel, that's actually capable of boring holes into solid rock, at least soft rock, like limestone, which is what I think these columns are made of. Now, think about this. Clams don't do very well on land. I assume you've never had to stop your car to let a thundering herd of clams cross the road. Clams only live in water. So if we have these columns and we have these burrows left by clams, well, that means the ocean at one time must have been up here. So we know that the ocean used to be way down here. And then for a while, it must have been up here. And currently, it's here. So we know that either sea level has changed or the elevation of the land has changed. Now, Lyle was sure that sea level hadn't really changed because there are other areas nearby where the Romans built things like harbor structures that are still in use. And you wouldn't expect that if the sea level over all of the Mediterranean Sea had changed. What must have happened, he said, was that the land must have sunk and then been raised over about 1600 years, just a couple of tens of feet. And in fact, he went back and looked at records of earthquakes and things like that, and he found there were historical cases of an earthquake that suddenly caused a portion of the coastline to raise or to sink down. People had actually observed this happening. So we know there's a process going on today, the process of earthquakes, that we have records can make the land rise and sink maybe just a couple of feet every time. We have evidence from this temple that the temple has sunk and risen a few tens of feet. And if you can have all of this happening in about 1600 years, what could happen in millions of years? The temple could be down at the bottom of the ocean or up on top of a high mountain, for all we know. All you need is a process that's going on today that we can observe, and that's earthquakes, multiplied by lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of time. And you can take, rocks that formed in the ocean and have fossil seashells in them, and they can end up on the tops of mountains. The summit of Mount Everest, the highest mountain in the world, is made of limestone that formed in an ocean and has fossils of sea critters in it. How did they get there? Lyle says you just need processes like earthquakes that we can observe now, multiplied by ridiculously long amounts of time, and anything can happen. You can end up with seashells on mountaintops. So Darwin's reading all of this, and as he's reading Lyle, the Beagle reaches South America and spends the next 3 years going up and down the coasts of the Atlantic and the Antarctic. You know, all of this, doing their assigned job, which was mapping the South American coastline. The maps, by the way, that the Beagle made were so accurate that the British Navy continued using them until the invention of satellites, which kind of made ground level mapping skills not as useful as they had been. But those charts were used for over 100 years. Darwin had money. His dad actually provided him with, they didn't have credit cards, but you could use what were called letters of credit to get money at banks. And he had the time and the resources to take long trips inland. Because he's not an officer on the ship, he doesn't really have any duties on the ship. So when the ship pulls into port, the officers and the men might have lots of things to do. Darwin can jump ship and go off and explore inland. So he rode all over South America, ended up writing a book on South American geology. He shot animals and birds and taxidermied them and sent them back to England. He shipped, plant specimens and rocks and fossils back to England. By the time he got back, a lot of people wanted to meet this guy because he'd made some important discoveries. A few years later, he would publish basically an edited version of his diary. It's now published as under the title Voyage of the Beagle, and still an interesting read if you like voyages of exploration. So he would write things like, delight itself is a weak term to express the feelings of a naturalist who for the first time has wandered by himself in a Brazilian forest. He got to see the rainforest when it was still pristine. South of Brazil, they spent a lot of time in Argentina, and that's a gaucho. Argentinians feel about gauchos kind of the way that we feel about cowboys. They were tough riding, rugged riders of the plains. South America has grasslands, kind of like we have the Great Plains. And Darwin got to travel with them as guides. And as he said, the gaucho is most obliging, polite, and hospitable, but at the same time, a bold, spirited fellow. So here is a gaucho using a couple of wooden balls on a string that he's throwing to entangle the legs of an animal. That's what gauchos used instead of lassos. Now, I thought that these were called bolas until I had an Argentinian student in this class who informed me that bolas is Argentinian for testicles. So I basically accidentally told him that this gaucho is throwing his testicles at these ostriches. And it was very funny at the time. Those birds, by the way, are not ostriches. They are a South American flightless bird called a rhea, R-H-E-A. Darwin was camping with some gauchos and they'd killed a rhea, and Darwin realized that it was a new species unknown to Western science. Unfortunately, he did not realize this until they'd eaten most of it. Much better eating than owls. But Darwin actually boxed up and taxidermied what was left of the rhea and ended up shipping it back to Britain. So when he's not doing all of this, he's also collecting fossils. And this is a fossil type that he collected. That's the skull right there, by the way. That's the eye. There's the mouth of a critter called a glyptodon. And you'll notice that the entire back of this thing is covered with a shell made of bony plates stuck together. Um, you know what this is in two guesses. This is not a turtle. Glyptodons are basically ginormous armadillos, and they're huge, but not just in having the bony covering, but in details of the skull and the pelvis. Glyptodons are very clearly similar to a uniquely South American group of mammals known as the armadillos. Now, you know the nine-banded armadillo, that's the one we get, Dasypus novum cinctus. This is actually a relatively recent migrant. There were no armadillos in Texas until about 1850, which means that the very first, defenders of the Alamo had nothing to eat for Thanksgiving dinner. There were no armadillos in Arkansas until about 100 years ago. Um, about 20 years ago, I was having a chat with a library worker whose elderly mother, I think, had actually seen an armadillo and had no idea what it was. She remembered, or her mom remembered a time when there weren't any armadillos in Arkansas. Nine-banded armadillos have relatively recently migrated here. There's 11 species of armadillo in South America, including the three-banded armadillo, the six-banded armadillo, and my personal favorite up at the top, the pink fairy armadillo. And I'm not kidding about the pink fairy armadillo. That is one of them. It has fluff, under the sides of its carapaces, and it is pink in color, and it looks like a freaking Pokemon. Right? This is the kind of thing that for a while my kid would be obsessed with collecting and then, throwing at somebody with a Charizard or a Bulbasaur or whatever the hell it is. Yeah, the pink fairy armadillo is a real thing. So is the screaming hairy armadillo, which would be a terrific name for a punk band. And the point of all this is that there was this odd parallel between living armadillos, which are quintessentially South American mammals, and these extinct bones that Darwin was digging up, which seemed to mirror the living. Glyptodons are huge. They're the size of riding mowers, but they're basically armadillos. Why should you have the fossils looking hauntingly like the living? And this kept happening. This is the skeleton of a critter called Mylodon. And again, it's much larger and had a different habitat. But in details of how it's put together, it looks a heck of a lot like another distinct South American group, the sloths. So there you've got a tree sloth right there. That's a living South American mammal. Here you have this fossil South American mammal that is different and yet fundamentally the same in structure. As Darwin put it, there was this wonderful relationship in the same continent between the dead and the living, which will, I do not doubt, throw more light on the appearance of organic beings on our Earth and their disappearance from it than any other class of facts. It'll take us till the last week, but we will look at this in more detail and look at some deeper reasons why we see this similarity. Some of his fossils seem to combine features of what we now call different animal classes. This is one he dug up. This is the skull of a plant-eating mammal, now extinct, called Toxodon platensis. So there's his Toxodon skull. And as Darwin would later write, the structure of its teeth, as Mr. Owen states, proves indisputably that it was intimately related to the gnawers, the rodents. In many details, it's allied to the pachydermata, the elephants. Judging from the position of its eyes, ears, and nostrils, it was probably aquatic like the dugong and manatee. How wonderfully are the different orders at the present time so well separated, blended together in different points of the structure of the Toxodon. If you go back in time, you start finding critters that don't easily fit into the taxa, the classes and orders and all of that that you're familiar with. And some of them blend features of what we would now call very separate classes if you go far enough back in time and look at sufficiently old fossils. Huh, wonder why that is. All right, I have 1107. Tell you what, we'll come back at 1120 and keep on going. So go ahead and take about 13 minutes. I will go ahead and stop the recording.